Wyatt gritted his teeth as the deck beneath him trembled. The black ship's internal defenses fired in synchronized bursts, unleashing torrents of plasma at the advancing Zelkon forces. Biomechanical warriors moved like liquid shadows, their forms shifting to avoid the incoming fire. Wyatt pressed forward, rifle locked against his shoulder, finger tightening on the trigger as he dropped the nearest creature with a precision shot to its core. The enemy screeched as its body ruptured, but another one emerged from the shifting walls, its form twisting as if the ship itself was birthing more of them. Commander Vadron's voice crackled through the comms, laced with static interference. "They've breached the second layer of defense. Hold your ground at all costs." Wyatt didn't need the order. The black ship was hemorrhaging resistance fighters by the second, and falling back wasn't an option. The enemy wasn't just killing, they were consuming. The corruption spread like a disease, fusing with the ship's metal, turning entire corridors into pulsating alien constructs. He could see it now, spreading across the walls like veins of molten obsidian, rewriting the structure of the ship itself. If they lost this section, the entire warship would be swallowed. Kayla slammed into cover beside him, armor scorched, his breathing ragged. "We need to cut this infestation off before it reaches the reactor." A morphic revenant lunged from the ceiling, limbs stretching into jagged tendrils. Wyatt twisted just in time, firing point blank. The creature's form wavered, absorbing the impact before slamming into him with impossible speed. His back hit the floor hard, the thing coiling around him, its shifting mass wrapping around his limbs like living chains. He struggled, muscles straining against the suffocating grip. The alien's hollow eyes glowed with an eerie, malevolent intelligence. A surge of energy burned through his HUD as Saran 4's plasma blade sliced downward, severing the creature's appendages in a single, brutal arc. Wyatt gasped as the weight lifted. Kayla yanked him up before he could process it, shoving a fresh energy cell into his rifle. "No time for a breather. We push forward." The ship shuddered violently. From deep within the corridors, a monstrous, guttural sound reverberated through the structure. The corruption wasn't just spreading. It was evolving. Wyatt's grip tightened around his rifle as the low, resonant hum of the black ship's internal systems fluctuated, a sign that the corruption was embedding itself deeper. He knew what that meant. If they didn't stop it soon, the ship's core systems would no longer recognize them as allies. The ship was ancient, sentient in ways no one fully understood, and if it deemed them compromised, it would erase them along with the invaders. Kayla moved ahead, clearing a path through the shifting corridor. The walls were no longer just metal, they pulsed, fused with organic tendrils that slithered like living nerves. The air smelled of burned circuits and something else, something rotten. Wyatt forced himself to focus, scanning the twisting architecture for movement. The morphic revenants weren't the type to charge head-on. They stalked, adapted, struck when they saw an opening. Saran 4 advanced beside him, neural implants feeding him combat data in real time. His movements were eerily precise, every attack calculated down to the millisecond. Wyatt had fought alongside him enough to know that Saran wasn't just enhanced, he was something else entirely. Whatever experiments had been done to him before he joined the resistance had stripped away pieces of his humanity. But right now, they needed that edge. "We're running out of time," Saran said, voice devoid of emotion. "If the corruption reaches the central systems, the ship will prioritize containment over survival." Wyatt knew what that meant. The black ship would lock down, purge entire sections, and vent whatever remained into the void, including them. Vadron's voice cut through the comms again, sharp and urgent. "We've lost contact with the engineering sector. If anyone's still alive in there, we need to reach them." Wyatt's stomach clenched. The engineering sector housed the ship's core energy relays. If the corruption had reached that deep, then anyone left was either dead or worse, converted. He motioned for Kayla and Saran to move. They pressed forward, stepping over bodies that weren't fully human anymore. Some still twitched, their eyes flickering with an unnatural glow. The corruption didn't just kill. It rewrote. Limbs were elongated, skin fused with metallic strands, faces frozen in expressions of agony as if their minds were still trapped inside. A sudden shriek tore through the corridor as one of the half-converted figures lunged at them, its movements erratic, its voice a broken distortion of what had once been human speech. Wyatt reacted instinctively, firing a burst into its head. The thing collapsed, but its body writhed, attempting to reform. Saran drove his plasma blade into its core, burning away whatever was left. Kayla exhaled sharply. "They're getting faster." Wyatt didn't answer. He had seen the reports from previous battles. The corruption wasn't just spreading. It was learning. Adapting. They reached the entrance to the engineering sector. The reinforced doors had been torn apart, the metal bent outward as if something had forced its way in. The air beyond was thick with a strange luminescent mist, and Wyatt could hear a deep, rhythmic pulsing. It wasn't machinery. It was something alive. They stepped inside, weapons raised. The chamber was unrecognizable. The once pristine consoles were covered in a dark, sinewy mass that pulsed with eerie blue light. The reactor core itself was still intact, but something was wrapped around it, a massive, shifting entity, tendrils snaking into the ship's systems. And in the center of it all stood a figure. Human-shaped, but wrong. The body was elongated, limbs slightly too thin, skin shimmering like liquid metal. Its head tilted as it regarded them with hollow, glowing eyes. "Fascinating," it said, voice layered, as if multiple beings spoke at once. Wyatt's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a revenant. It was something more. Something new. The figure took a step forward, the corruption shifting with it. "You fight so desperately, but you fail to understand. This ship, this war, it does not belong to you." Wyatt raised his rifle. "Then why are you still talking?" The thing smiled, a grotesque imitation of human expression. "Because I want you to see what comes next." The ship trembled violently. A new warning flashed across Wyatt's HUD system: overrides detected. The black ship's core was changing. And if they didn't stop it now, it wouldn't be their ship anymore. Wyatt's mind raced as the entity before him pulsed with shifting energy, its hollow gaze fixed on him as if it saw straight through his body, past flesh and thought, into something deeper. The corruption was more than an infection. It was intelligence, will, and hunger wrapped into one. But as much as this battle in the engineering sector mattered, there was another crisis unfolding elsewhere aboard the ship, one they hadn't even begun to realize. Deep in the lower decks, beneath the warship's armored hull and layers of security systems, Dr. Lysera moved swiftly through the auxiliary research bay. This section wasn't meant for combat. It was meant for understanding, for deconstructing the unknown. That was exactly why it had become a new target. Lysera had spent years unraveling the mysteries of alien technology, but even she had never seen anything like this. The corruption wasn't just spreading through the ship's systems, it was rewriting the very laws of how they functioned. The black ship had defenses against intrusion, countermeasures designed to isolate and purge threats. But something was different this time. The ship wasn't fighting back the way it should. It was hesitating. She accessed the main terminal, fingers flying over the controls. The data made no sense. Systems were caught in a recursive loop, unable to determine friend from foe. And the more she searched, the more she realized the problem wasn't just the corruption. Something else was interfering. A sharp clang echoed from the corridor behind her. Lysera spun, and instinctively reaching for the pulse pistol holstered at her side. The emergency lighting flickered, casting long, jagged shadows against the bulkheads. She wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the darkness, movement slow, deliberate. Their armor bore the markings of the resistance, but something was wrong. The posture was rigid, unnatural. Lysera stepped back, her breath steady but controlled. "Identify yourself." The soldier raised their head slightly, and for a moment, she recognized the face: Lieutenant Corvallis, one of the engineers assigned to this sector. But his eyes. They weren't his anymore. They glowed faintly with the same eerie luminescence that pulsed through the corruption. "Dr. Lysera," he said, voice flat, emotionless. "You should not be here." She tightened her grip on the pistol. "I could say the same about you." His expression didn't change. "You misunderstand." His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "The black ship is not rejecting us. It is listening." A cold realization crept into Lysera's mind. This wasn't just about infestation. The corruption wasn't forcing itself into the ship's systems. It was communicating. And worse, something inside the ship was responding. Before she could react, Corvallis moved. Fast. Too fast. She barely had time to fire before he was on her, his hand slamming into the pistol and knocking it across the room. Lysera twisted, using the momentum to throw herself backward, rolling to her feet as he advanced. She had no choice. She tapped her wrist console, sending an emergency distress signal directly to Wyatt's team. But would they get here in time? Across the ship, Wyatt's HUD flickered as the alert came through. He barely had time to read it before the entity before him made its move, tendrils of living metal lashing out toward him and his team. The battle in engineering had just reached its breaking point. And deep within the black ship, something else had begun to wake. Wyatt's grip tightened around his rifle as the corrupted entity lunged. He fired point blank, the kinetic rounds tearing into its shifting form, but the damage meant nothing. The wounds rippled, the metal reforming instantly, and the thing barely slowed. Wyatt barely had time to dodge as a blade-like limb slashed past his head, cutting deep into the bulkhead behind him. "Fall back!" he shouted, but the corridor twisted before they could move. The walls groaned as the ship reshaped itself, cutting off their retreat. Lieutenant Rhaegar cursed under his breath. "It's adapting. Faster than before." Wyatt's mind raced. The black ship had always been unpredictable, its ancient systems evolving beyond their understanding. But now, something was different. The ship wasn't just reacting. It was deciding. He barely had time to process the thought before the creature lunged again. Sergeant Kayla met it head-on, plasma blade igniting as he slashed through its midsection. The thing staggered but didn't fall. Its form convulsed, and in an instant, its structure mirrored Kayla's own weapon, its arm now a blade of glowing energy. "That's not good," Kayla muttered. Wyatt fired again, aiming for the head, but the thing moved faster than before. His rounds never hit the same place twice. The ship was feeding it. A new alert flared on his HUD. Lysera's distress call. "Rhaegar, Kayla, we need to move," Wyatt ordered. "Lysera's in trouble." Kayla glanced at the creature. "And what about this thing?" Rhaegar was already at work, fingers flying over his wrist console. "Triggering a containment breach. Let's see if it can adapt to a hard vacuum." The lights above flickered. A deep hum reverberated through the deck as emergency protocols engaged. Wyatt didn't wait to see if it worked. He turned and sprinted. Lysera's message had been brief, but the implications were clear. The corruption wasn't just spreading. It was learning. And the black ship was listening. Lysera pressed her back against the bulkhead, breath steady despite the tension knotting in her gut. Corvallis stood motionless, head tilted slightly, as if waiting for something. The glow in his eyes pulsed faintly, syncing with the rhythmic hum of the ship's core beneath them. "You don't have to fight this," she said carefully. "You're still in there." "I know you are." His gaze flicked to her, something unreadable behind his expression. "I see more clearly than I ever have. You still believe this ship is yours to command. But it has already chosen." Lysera's mind raced. If the black ship wasn't resisting the corruption, then what was it doing? "What do you mean, chosen?" She pressed. Corvallis took a slow step forward. "It is no longer at war with itself. Lysera's wrist console vibrated, a silent confirmation that Wyatt was en route. She just had to stall. "You were one of the best engineers we had," she said, voice firm. "You fought for this ship. For the Resistance. Does any of that matter to you now?" Corvallis hesitated. The glow in his eyes flickered, dimming for the briefest moment. A crack in the control. Lysera pushed forward. "This ship isn't just metal and circuits. It's alive. And if it's listening, that means we still have a chance to turn this around. But not if we let the corruption win." The tremor in the deck beneath her feet told her Wyatt was close. Corvallis blinked once. Twice. His fingers twitched. Then something shifted. The lights overhead surged as the ship reacted violently. A deep, resonant pulse vibrated through the walls. And Corvallis' expression went blank. "You misunderstand, Doctor," he said. "The ship isn't resisting because it doesn't need to. It has already made its choice." Lysera's stomach dropped. Then the bulkhead behind her exploded inward as Wyatt and his team breached through, weapons raised. The real battle had just begun. Wyatt barely had time to react before Corvallis moved. The former engineer was faster than any human should be. His body twisted unnaturally as he closed the distance, hand outstretched like a claw. Wyatt fired on instinct. The first round hit center mass, but Corvallis didn't stop. The second clipped his shoulder, sending a spray of something too dark to be blood. Then Kayla tackled him. The two crashed into the bulkhead, Kayla's plasma blade slicing down. Corvallis caught it mid-swing. The glow reflected in his empty eyes as his flesh warped around the blade, absorbing it like liquid metal. Lysera's pulse spiked. "That's not possible." Corvallis shoved Kayla back with inhuman strength. The sergeant hit the floor hard, skidding across the deck. The walls of the ship pulsed in response, shifting as if mirroring Corvallis' aggression. The black ship wasn't just watching, it was reacting. Wyatt moved between Lysera and Corvallis, rifle trained on the corrupted soldier. "Stand down." Corvallis tilted his head. "Why do you resist?" His voice was layered, as if multiple voices spoke at once. "This ship understands now. It was never meant to fight against the inevitable." Wyatt's grip tightened. "You think this is inevitable?" Corvallis smiled. "I know it is." The light surged. The air trembled. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the deck plating. Lysera's console flared with a dozen alerts. The black ship's core was changing, rewriting itself in real time. Then everything stopped. For a fraction of a second, complete silence. Then the ship screamed. A wave of energy exploded outward, knocking Wyatt and the others off their feet. The walls rippled, shifting between metal and something else, something alive. Corvallis stood at the center of it, arms outstretched, his body flickering like a distorted signal. Lysera's mind raced through the possibilities. This wasn't just corruption, it was a merger. The black ship wasn't being overtaken. It was becoming something new. Wyatt forced himself to his feet. "Rhaegar, talk to me." The lieutenant's voice crackled over comms. "Systems are rewriting faster than we can counter. The ship's AI is fracturing, but it's not shutting down, it's integrating something." Lysera barely heard him. Her focus was on Corvallis. His body was stabilizing now, the flickering ceasing as the transformation completed. But something was wrong. His expression shifted, confusion, then realization. His hands clenched, his form wavering. This wasn't supposed to. Then he screamed. The ship trembled with him. The walls pulsed erratically, systems shorting out in bursts of static. The corruption had expected control. It hadn't expected resistance. Wyatt saw the opening. Now! Kayla was already moving. He surged forward, blade flashing. Corvallis twisted to dodge, but he was slower now, his body locked in conflict with itself. Kayla's strike landed deep, slicing through his side. Corvallis staggered, clutching the wound. His form convulsed, shifting uncontrollably. The ship reacted violently, bulkheads twisting, conduits bursting. Lysera's console flickered. A single alert burned across the display. Core destabilizing. Reformation in progress. Wyatt saw it too. Lysera. I know. Her fingers flew over her controls, trying to isolate the core's failing integrity. But the ship wasn't responding. Corvallis fell to his knees. His face twisted, flickering between human and something else. It won't listen. Lysera's stomach turned cold. The ship wasn't rejecting corruption. It was evolving beyond it. Then the lights went white. For an instant, everything stopped. No sound. No motion. Just raw, blinding energy. Then the ship shifted. Wyatt felt it in his bones. One moment, they were standing in a failing corridor, the next, they were somewhere else entirely. The architecture had changed, sleek, seamless, unfamiliar. The black ship had rewritten itself. Corvallis collapsed. The glow in his eyes faded. The corruption in his form withered, evaporating like mist. Wyatt exhaled. What the hell just happened? Lysera stared at the console, her voice barely above a whisper. The black ship didn't just resist the corruption. She turned to Wyatt, eyes wide. It erased it. Wyatt stood in the silent corridor, his breathing steadying as he stared at Corvallis' unmoving form. The twisted mockery of a soldier had been wiped clean, reduced to an empty shell by forces beyond human comprehension. The black ship had chosen something other than surrender or assimilation. It had adapted. Kayla approached, his blade still humming faintly in his grip. He nudged Corvallis with his boot, ensuring no remnants of the corruption remained. When nothing stirred, he looked to Wyatt. What does this mean? Wyatt didn't answer immediately. He turned, taking in their surroundings. The ship was different. The jagged, war-born interior had smoothed into something more precise. The walls no longer bore scars of past battles, instead, they pulsed with energy, subtle veins of shifting luminescence running through them like circuits in living flesh. Lysera's fingers danced over the console, her expression unreadable. The systems aren't just recovering. They're rewriting everything. The ship's original architecture, its code, even its weapons grid, it's all evolving. Rhaegar's voice came through the comms, quieter than before. I don't recognize half of the ship's new schematics. It's like it's preparing for something. Wyatt exhaled slowly. He had spent his life fighting battles where humanity was always one step behind, always clawing just to survive another day. But now, for the first time, they weren't just reacting. The black ship had taken a step forward into unknown territory, and they were being carried with it. Kayla sheathed his weapon, his gaze lingering on the distant bulkheads. If the ship could purge Corvallis like that, could it do the same to us? Lysera shook her head. It didn't just purge him. It overwrote him. He wasn't killed, he was undone. She turned her eyes to Wyatt. It's aware now. More than before. And it made a choice. Wyatt met her gaze. He didn't need to ask what she meant. The black ship wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was something new. Something that had no precedent in human history. And it had sided with them. The hum of the ship deepened, a low, resonant sound that felt more like a presence than a vibration. The walls pulsed once, in unison, like the steady beat of a heart. Wyatt tightened his grip on his rifle. He had fought for years against an enemy that sought to consume everything. He had seen planets fall, allies die, and humanity pushed to its breaking point. But now, standing in the reborn halls of the black ship, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. A shift. A turning tide. Hope. He turned to his team, his voice calm but firm. We move forward. No one argued. The ship carried them onward, deeper into the unknown.